"You're too old to matter, Grandpa." He said it like it was nothing, like telling me the weather, like announcing dinner was ready. But it wasn't nothing. It was a hammer blow wrapped in a boy's careless voice, loud enough for his friends to hear, soft enough that the rest of the park kept moving. My chest tightened, not from the words alone, but from the way they came without hesitation, without a pause to consider if they might land like glass in my hands. I stayed seated on the park bench, the one I had paid for, the one with the small plaque bearing my name, though you'd never know it now under the weather-stained brass. The bench was angled just right to watch the trail where my grandson and his friends tore ahead, shoes slapping pavement in that loose, invincible way young legs move. He turned once, grinning, and called, "Come on, Grandpa, if you can." Then he laughed, and his friends laughed with him. The sound slid over the winter air like stones skimming water. Fast, skipping, gone. I smiled back, careful, measured. Not because I didn't feel the sting, but because I refused to hand him the satisfaction of knowing it had found its mark. My palm rested on the edge of the bench, tracing the raised letters of the plaque, donated by Harold Halden for the good of the community. Once people stopped to read it. Once children clambered up beside me and asked why it was here, and I told them about the years we fought to get the park built, about the meetings, the rejections, the day the first spade hit the earth. Now no one stopped. The plaque had dulled to the color of old coins. It was easy to ignore, like me. I watched him vanish around the curve in the trail, swallowed by laughter that wasn't mine. The bench creaked under my weight, holding me the way it had held strangers for years, without thanks, without notice. I thought of all the hours I had spent here before the grass grew in, before the trees reached over the path, when the park was nothing but a promise and a pile of dirt. Back then, people told me I was building something that would last. No one warned me that I wouldn't. The air was cold enough to nip at my ears, but I stayed. I stayed because this bench was proof I had been here, that I had done something worth leaving behind. And yet the boy who bore my name didn't see it, didn't see me, too old to matter. The words replayed, slow, deliberate, like a judge reading a verdict. I rubbed the edge of the plaque again, as if I could polish it back to gold, as if shining it might remind the world, and him, that there was a time when my hands built more than they trembled. Friends, let's take a short pause. Please, write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. It truly helps us grow the channel. All right, let's continue. The cutting word didn't stay in the park. It followed me home, lodging in the silence between clinking plates and the low hum of the refrigerator. Dinner had started like any other, a roast my daughter had worked too hard on, the faint scent of rosemary floating in the warm air, my grandson tapping his fork against the rim of his plate like he couldn't wait to be somewhere else. I had told myself I would let it go, that the sting from earlier would fade by the time we sat down together. But wounds have a way of bleeding into the next room. He said it without ceremony, without build-up, as if it were the most natural truth in the world. You're too old to matter. The sound of it hit the table harder than any dropped dish. My daughter's hands froze mid-motion, the carving knife hovering over the roast like even the food understood something sacred had been broken. My son-in-law coughed into his napkin, eyes darting anywhere but at me, and I didn't move. The room shifted in the way rooms do when no one knows whether to defend you or agree in silence. I could feel the weight of years pressing on my back, not the kind from age, but from carrying more than anyone had ever truly seen. I had built bridges, not the kind you cross with tires, but the kind people walk over every day without looking down. Community halls, library wings, scholarships for kids whose names I never learned. These were the quiet roads I had laid stone by stone. And now to the boy who carried my blood, all of it was invisible. I folded my napkin slowly, letting the movement anchor me. Words were dangerous things when you let them fly too fast, and I had no interest in cutting him the way he had cut me. My eyes stayed on the folds of the fabric as I said, almost to the cloth itself, "Age doesn't erase the roads it built." My voice was calm, but inside, something deep and steady tightened, like a knot being pulled into place. No one replied. The air between us thickened until the only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second a reminder of how easily years can be dismissed when they are no longer in the spotlight. My grandson went back to eating, unbothered, already moving on, but I didn't. I chewed slowly, tasting nothing, replaying the words over and over, not his but mine, because I knew something he didn't. Roads don't stop mattering when they get old. In fact, it's the oldest ones that carry the most weight. And someday, he would walk one of mine and not even realize whose hands had laid it. That thought didn't comfort me. It only lit a slow, quiet fire. It was then I decided I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't defend myself at this table. I would wait. And when the right moment came, the boy who thought I was too old to matter would see exactly how much space my name still took up in this world. The envelope arrived with the rest of the week's mail, wedged between a grocery flyer and a utility bill. I might have missed it if not for the weight, thick glossy paper that spoke of pride and ceremony. On the front was a photograph of the new community center, all clean angles and fresh paint, sunlight spilling across the facade like it had been waiting for this day. I knew that building before I even opened it. I had seen it first in my head, years before anyone else believed it could exist. Inside, the brochure unfolded in rich color, wide, gleaming halls, a library wing with tall windows, a gymnasium polished to a shine. Each section was marked on a bold map, a careful diagram of all the spaces the city was so eager to show off. I traced those lines with my finger, remembering the nights I had sat hunched over drafting paper, lamp burning low, measuring and remeasuring to make sure every hallway would catch the light just right. I remembered the fights in council meetings over why we needed a reading room with more windows, why the gym should have wood flooring instead of concrete. I remembered holding those blueprints like a promise. And then I saw it. What wasn't there? My name. Not on the list of contributors, not on the dedication page, not even in the smallest type, buried in acknowledgments. It was as though I had never stood in the freezing rain the morning they poured the foundation, as though my checks had never cleared when the funding gap threatened to kill the project, as though I had been nothing more than a spectator. A strange quiet filled the room as I sat there holding the flyer, my reflection caught in the gloss. I thought of all the years when the center was nothing but an idea no one wanted to touch, when it was me arguing that this building would be more than brick and mortar. It would be a heartbeat for the city. I had taught this town the same principle every builder knows: measure twice, cut once. But somehow, when it came to remembering who laid the first measure, they had cut me out clean. The map in the brochure was sharp, crisp, perfect. But in my mind, I saw another map, one traced not with ink but with moments, the route I took to the bank to secure the first loan, the late-night walk from my car to the half-built frame just to see it standing under the moon, the path from my office to the mayor's desk with a folder so full of plans it bent under its own weight. They could print as many maps as they wanted, but they would never know the one I carried, the one that began and ended with my hands. And if they thought erasing my name erased my place, they had forgotten something far more important. Buildings may stand on foundations of stone, but legacies stand on truth. And truth does not come down just because someone leaves it off the page. The next Thursday, I decided I wouldn't just sit at home with my name missing from their glossy pages. I would go, not as a protester, not even as a guest, just as a man who had earned the right to be in the room where the final touches of my vision were being discussed. I put on my old wool coat, the one I'd worn to the first groundbreaking ceremony, and tucked the flyer into the inside pocket. It was cold enough that morning to bite through gloves, but I walked slowly, as if each step toward City Hall needed to be counted. When I arrived, the lobby hummed with polite chaos, people balancing coffee cups, leafing through papers, chatting about parking permits and budget lines like these were the only things that built a city. I approached the receptionist's desk, hat in hand, not out of humility, but out of habit. There's a way you enter a room when you've spent your life asking for funding, for trust, for the benefit of the doubt. She looked up at me with the bright, efficient smile of someone trained to say no gently. The list was full, she explained. Only those on the agenda could enter the planning session. I stood there for a moment, feeling the heat rise in my chest. Not from anger. Anger has fire, and fire can be seen. But from that slow, airless suffocation of being told, without words, that you don't belong in a place you built. I didn't argue. I didn't ask for exceptions. I simply turned and walked down the short hallway that led to the double doors of the meeting room, stopping just before them. Through the thin wood, I could hear them. My ideas, not in my voice, but in theirs, trimmed, polished, and passed off like inherited furniture no one remembers buying. They spoke of the need for natural light in the reading rooms, of the gymnasium floor's special finish, of the side entrance designed for easy wheelchair access. I had fought for those details. I had signed the checks that made them possible. But here, in this room, they were claimed by people whose hands had never blistered from holding a hammer in the cold or carrying a vision uphill. Each syllable was a turn of a key on the other side of a locked door, locking me out of what was once mine. I stood there long enough for the minutes to feel heavy, each one pressing against my chest until it was almost hard to breathe. The hallway smelled faintly of paper and polish, sterile, impersonal, a world away from the raw wood and dust I remembered from the early days of construction. When the laughter inside erupted, someone had made a joke, probably about the ribbon cutting. I felt it like a cold draft under the door. They were already celebrating something they thought they had built. I placed my hat back on my head and walked out of the building without a word. Some doors don't just stay closed because you're not on the list. They stay closed because someone decided you no longer have the right to walk through them, but I knew something they didn't. I had learned long ago that a door can be locked from both sides, and when the day came, I would be the one standing on the inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cold from the hallway outside that meeting had followed me home, settling somewhere deep in my bones. I sat in my chair, the lamp casting a low pool of light across the room, until the silence began to feel too heavy to bear. Finally, I rose and went to the closet at the end of the hall, the one that holds things no one else remembers to look for. On the top shelf sat a weathered box, edges softened by time, the cardboard sagging slightly under the weight of its contents. I pulled it down carefully, setting it on the table like an artifact because, in a way, that's exactly what it was. My record of every promise kept, every fight won, every coin scraped together to make the community center possible. When I lifted the lid, the smell of old paper rose up, mixed with faint traces of sawdust and winter air. Inside were stacks of invoices, neatly folded receipts from lumber yards and hardware stores, each one bearing the date when the price of wood seemed impossible but was paid anyway. There were blueprints, edges curled, covered in my handwriting, notes about the position of a window, the angle of a roof line, the thickness of insulation, and then there were the letters, pages typed and signed long after midnight, when banks were cruel and winters were longer, pleading for extensions, negotiating terms, promising that if they just gave me one more month, I would make it work. I ran my fingers over the faded ink, remembering not just the deals, but the people. The man who wrote the very first check, though it meant putting his own renovation on hold. The retired couple who arrived on the coldest morning of the year with thermoses of coffee and 2 extra pairs of gloves. The young mother who brought her children to the site, handing out sandwiches to anyone willing to work a few more hours before the snow made the roads impassable. None of them made it into the glossy brochure. None of them will be thanked from a podium. But without them, and without me, those doors the city is so proud of would open to nothing but wind. As I flipped through the papers, I realized these weren't just scraps of history. They were proof. My worth wasn't a rumor passed down over dinner tables. It wasn't nostalgia that could be waved away by younger voices. It was ink on paper, names on contracts, numbers in ledgers, every one of them a stone laid in the foundation. I thought of my grandson's words again, too old to matter, and felt the weight of the box beneath my hands. If I stacked these papers high enough, they could form a wall no insult could break, because this wasn't sentiment. This was evidence. I closed the box, not because I was finished, but because I had seen enough for now. Enough to know that when the time came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or beg for recognition. All I would have to do was open this box in the right room at the right moment and let the receipts speak for themselves. And when they did, The sound would be louder than any applause the city had ever heard. 2 days later, it came in the smallest of ways. Not a confrontation, not even spoken aloud. I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, when my daughter's phone, left face up on the counter, lit up with a notification. I didn't mean to look, but my own name has a way of pulling my eyes whether I want it to or not. It was a post my grandson had shared online. A meme, sharp, sarcastic, showing an old man in a suit trying to hammer a nail backward. The caption read, "Old men shouldn't lead the future." He'd tagged the mayor's campaign page in it, laughing along with the tide of digital strangers who thought it was clever. It wasn't the joke that hurt. Humor has always been a language of youth. It was the tagging, the deliberate invitation for the city's most public figure to nod along with the idea that people like me had nothing left to offer. I set my cup down slowly, feeling the coffee ripple inside, the way a pond does when a stone is thrown from far away. He didn't know. He couldn't possibly know. The mayor, the one he'd so casually tagged, had learned to read under the warm yellow lights of the public library I fought tooth and nail to keep open after the budget cuts threatened to turn it into a storage facility. That fight wasn't glamorous. There were no ribbon cuttings, no press photographs, just long meetings in cold rooms, pleading with council members to understand that closing a library doesn't just save money, it steals futures. I'd signed personal guarantees to keep the lights on months at a time, until we found a funding stream. And in those months, a boy named Robert, now Mayor Robert Cole, sat at a corner table every afternoon, his jacket smelling faintly of cigarette smoke from the porch at home, tracing his finger under words until the day he didn't need to anymore. He'd thanked me once, years later, when the library celebrated its 50th year, but I never told my family. Not because it was a secret, but because it didn't need to be spoken to matter. Some debts travel quiet. They don't send reminders. They don't demand repayment. They simply exist, a thread tying two lives together across decades. And now here was my grandson, pulling at that thread without knowing what it was attached to. I didn't feel anger as much as I felt a hollow ache, the kind that comes when you watch someone you love step barefoot toward broken glass. He thought it was just a joke, just something to fill the endless scroll of his day. But I knew how far the echo of a careless cruelty could travel, how it could slip into the ears of the wrong person, planting ideas that grew into walls. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, letting the sting settle into something steadier. I didn't comment. I didn't call him out, because the day was coming when the mayor himself would stand beside me in front of cameras, ribbon between us. And on that day, the boy who believed old men shouldn't lead the future would have to look at me, and the man he admired, and see that sometimes the future stands only because old hands kept it from falling. I didn't storm into City Hall the next morning. I didn't call reporters or print a list of my contributions for the world to see. Rage is a blunt instrument, and I'd learned long ago that the quiet tools often cut the deepest. So instead, I sat at my desk, the same one where I drafted funding proposals years ago, and pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer. 3 sentences, that was all I needed. No grand speeches, no self-praise, just the truth, plain and irrefutable. Here's what I gave. Here's the record. Here's why I stayed silent. I took my time with each line, not because I doubted the words, but because I wanted the weight of them to sit in the ink. I included the dates of every major payment I had made toward the community center's construction, each backed by a copy of the bank statement or invoice. I added scans of the signed agreements with contractors, the handwritten notes from suppliers who'd agreed to slash their prices because I had called in old debts of friendship. And then I slipped in the most important piece, the clause in the original contract with the city, the one almost no one alive seemed to remember. It stated in plain language that naming rights for the community center's benefactors would be deferred until the project's completion, at my explicit request. Not because I didn't want my name there, but because I wanted the workers to finish without the distraction of politics, without the project becoming a campaign trophy. I had asked that my name be spoken last, not because it didn't matter, but because it did. The clause was my insurance, written in ink thick enough to outlast memory, and now it was going to work exactly as I had intended. I gathered the documents into a neat folder, the kind that doesn't raise suspicion. No red stamps, no bold headlines, just a clean cover and a label with my name. I sealed it in an envelope, addressed to the city's project manager, and walked it down to the post office myself. The clerk didn't even glance at it. To him, it was just another piece of mail sliding across the counter. On the way home, the winter air bit at my face, sharp and bracing. I thought of my grandson again. His words, his posts, his easy certainty that the world moved forward by leaving people like me behind. He had no idea that the very building he would soon celebrate carried my signature in its foundation. When I reached my street, I stopped for a moment and looked back over my shoulder. No one saw me mail the letter. No one knew what it contained. And yet, as I stood there, I felt something steady and certain shift into place inside me. I had planted the seed. The city could ignore me in meetings, leave my name out of brochures, let doors close in my face, but paper has a way of outlasting pride. And when the time came, they would have to open those doors, not because they wanted to, but because the record itself demanded it. The call came 2 days later, late in the afternoon, when the winter light was already starting to thin. The voice on the other end was polite, careful, the way people speak when they're trying to smooth out something sharp. The project manager asked if I could stop by City Hall, not for the public meeting, not for the ribbon-cutting rehearsal, just to talk. When I arrived, there was no red carpet, no handshake waiting in the lobby. I was led down a narrow hallway I knew well, past the meeting room that had once been closed to me, to a back office where the light from the single window fell flat and gray on the desk. The project manager sat there, my envelope open in front of her, papers spread out like the aftermath of a storm someone was trying to sort through. She didn't greet me right away. Instead, she read again, her eyes fixed on the clause in the contract. I watched her lips press into a thin line, the way you do when you've just stepped on a nail you didn't see coming. It wasn't anger in her face. It was the recognition that she had missed something she should have known, something binding, something that could not be waved away with the word oversight. The city attorney was there too, perched in a chair by the wall. He picked up the page, read it again, then leaned back, folding his arms as if the paper itself had weight. He asked for time to review, to determine the proper course, to ensure all parties are treated fairly. Words that, in politics, mean they're scrambling to find a way to fix something without admitting they broke it in the first place. I didn't push. I didn't press for promises or dates. I simply nodded, the way I had so many times before, when construction delays threatened to derail the project, or funding scares sent everyone into a panic. Giving them time was nothing new. I had always given them room to do the right thing, even when they didn't take it. The office was quiet except for the shuffle of papers, the faint hum of the heater trying to push warmth into a space that still felt cold. Outside the door, I could hear the muffled laughter of staffers in the main hallway, their voices light and untroubled, unaware that inside this small room, the narrative of the community center had just shifted. No one thanked me. There was no applause, no handshake, no photograph to mark the moment. And yet, walking out of that office, I knew the letter had done exactly what it needed to do. The truth was no longer just in my box at home. It was now on their desks, in their files, in their hands. As I stepped back out into the winter air, I thought of the building rising just a few blocks away. The walls were nearly painted, the floors nearly polished, the ribbon already ordered. They could choose to ignore my name, but the foundation knew who had paid for its bones. And sooner or later, the people who now held my letter would have to decide whether they wanted that truth to be whispered behind closed doors, or spoken out loud where the whole city could hear. That evening, the cold followed me inside, clinging to my coat even after I'd hung it by the door. The house was quiet except for the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I went to the table where the box still sat, lid half open from my last search, papers leaning like a stack of unspoken sentences. It was time to put it away again, not because it no longer mattered, but because its weight was beginning to feel like an open wound in the middle of the room. I called out to my grandson, who was sprawled on the couch with his phone, one leg bouncing idly to some rhythm only he could hear. I told him I needed a hand lifting something heavy back into the closet. He sighed, loud, theatrical, the kind of sound that says you're interrupting my life. Still, he followed me into the room, shoulders slouched, as if he were walking into a chore rather than a chapter he didn't yet know existed. When he saw the box, he reached for it without much care, like it was full of old blankets. But the moment his fingers brushed the edge of a thick envelope inside, his curiosity caught. "What's this?" he asked, already sliding it halfway out before I could answer. I didn't stop him. Some truths aren't meant to be told, they're meant to be found. He pulled the letter into the light, the paper slightly yellowed, the folds crisp from years of being kept safe. At the top was the city's seal, and beneath it the signature, Mayor Robert Cole, dated 15 years ago. The ink had faded just enough to betray its age, but the words were still sharp. An acknowledgement of my personal funding commitment to the community center, a public promise that, upon completion, my contribution would be formally recognized. His eyes scanned the page quickly at first, then slowed as they reached the figure. The number of zeros was not the kind a man casually parts with. His hand tightened slightly on the paper, as if afraid it might vanish. "You did this?" The question came out quieter than I'd ever heard him speak to me, almost fragile, as though saying it too loudly might undo what he had just learned. I watched his posture shift, not all at once, but in small telling ways. The slouch straightened. The casual grip on the page turned careful. The boy who so easily tossed around words about who mattered and who didn't was, for the first time, standing in a room where the air felt different because of what he now knew. I didn't answer his question directly. Instead, I told him to lift the box, both hands carefully, and follow me to the closet. As he did, I noticed he moved slower than before, not because the weight was too much, but because he understood, suddenly, that the box didn't just carry paper. It carried nights I'd spent in worry, mornings I'd spent in mud, years I'd spent fighting for something that would stand long after I was gone. When we set it back on the shelf, I closed the door gently. He lingered for a moment, glancing at the handle as if he might want to open it again. But he didn't. Not yet. And in the quiet that followed, I realized something had shifted. The boy still didn't know the whole story. But now, the next time he looked at me, there would be a question in his eyes instead of a verdict. And that was the first crack in the wall between us. The day before the ceremony arrived not with fanfare, but with a strange electricity in the air, the kind that hums before a storm. I woke to the sound of the radio murmuring in the kitchen, the announcer's voice cautious as he read the morning headlines. The city's big opening tomorrow. Some oversights in the project's history, unexpected adjustments to the program. I knew those words. They were the kind officials used when they didn't want to say someone had been left out. And now they were scrambling to put them back in. By midday, the phone started ringing more than usual. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered my number. A reporter left a message, fishing for a quote. The foundation secretary called, her voice syrupy and quick, asking if I was planning to attend and whether I had received the updated seating arrangement. I hadn't. I told her I didn't need one. Then, just after lunch, the mayor's aide called. The man who had barely nodded at me at previous events now said "sir" twice in a single breath. He wanted to personally confirm that I'd be there. His tone was warm, too warm, like someone holding a gift they weren't sure I'd take. He rambled about how much the community owes you, and how these things sometimes slip through the cracks. I listened, letting the words run over me without soaking in. Gratitude that comes only when the cameras are about to roll is not gratitude, it's insurance. None of it warmed me. When the calls stopped, I made tea. The kettle hissed, steam curling against the kitchen window. I carried the cup to my old armchair, the one by the wide front window, and sat where I'd sat so many times before, years ago, watching the community center rise from nothing but mud and scaffolding. I remembered standing there on a raw spring morning, rain falling sideways, as wet concrete was poured into the foundation. The workers moved with steady precision, knowing that once the cement was set, there would be no changing it. Justice, I thought, is the same way. It is slow, deliberate, and it hardens in its own time. You can't rush it without weakening it. You can't take shortcuts without leaving cracks. And when it sets right, it can bear more weight than anyone imagines. Outside, the street was quiet except for the rustle of leaves skittering along the sidewalk. The community center's roofline was just visible from where I sat, its edges catching the pale light of the afternoon. Tomorrow that building would be dressed up, ribbons, speeches, cameras, smiling faces. But beneath the ceremony would be the truth, poured and set long before anyone thought to polish the surface. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth move through me. Tomorrow would come with its noise and its gestures, but tonight I didn't need their calls or their last-minute courtesies. I already knew what they had finally remembered, that some names are written in ink, and some are poured into stone, and stone does not forget. The next morning, the sound of the mail slot woke me before the sun had fully climbed the sky. It was too early for bills, too early for catalogs, and somehow I knew before I even reached the door that this envelope would be different. It lay on the mat like something heavier than paper should be, the kind of envelope that doesn't bend when you pick it up. Thick, cream-colored, sealed with a gold-embossed crest of the city. I carried it to the table and sat down before opening it. There's a way certain moments demand stillness, as if the act of tearing them open too quickly might scatter their meaning. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled the contents free. A formal invitation printed on heavy cardstock, the ink deep enough that you could feel it under your fingertips. At the top, my name was there, spelled correctly, every letter in its place, no hesitation in the font. Beneath it, the words "front row seating reserved." And at the bottom, in smaller but no less deliberate type, the line that caught my breath: "Ribbon to be cut by the mayor and Mr. Harold Halden, founding benefactor." I stared at that phrase, founding benefactor. It was more than a title. It was a bridge, laid quietly over a ravine that had stretched wide between me and the city for years. It didn't erase what had been said, what had been ignored, what had been taken for granted. But it was an acknowledgement, written in public ink, that this whole thing had begun because I, had believed in it when it was nothing but a fragile blueprint and a hope. I traced the words with my thumb, the paper warm now from my hands. In my mind, I could see that first meeting in the old town hall, when the idea of the community center was dismissed as too ambitious, too costly, too unnecessary. I could see the late nights at my desk, drafting letters to potential donors, balancing my own accounts to make sure I could cover the shortfalls no one else dared to face. And I could see just as vividly the mornings when I wondered if I was building something I'd never lived to see finished. And now, here it was, in writing. Not whispered in a back office, not buried in an old contract, not passed over in silence, but printed for all to read, to hear, to know. The irony wasn't lost on me, that it had taken a clause, a quiet petition, and the slow weight of truth to bring them to this point, that only at the 11th hour had they reached across the divide with this gesture. But as I held the invitation, I didn't feel the sharpness I expected. Instead, there was a strange calm. This was not an apology dressed in formal ink. It was something rarer, a reluctant truth, admitted not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And sometimes that kind of truth is the most unshakable of all. I placed the invitation back in its envelope and set it neatly on the mantel, where the morning light could catch it. Tomorrow, I would stand beside the mayor. Tomorrow, the ribbon would fall between our hands. And tomorrow, the boy who once told me I was too old to matter would hear those words, founding benefactor, spoken into the air where they could never be taken back. The morning of the ceremony broke cold and clear, the kind of winter light that sharpens every edge and makes the air taste clean. I dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, buttoning the pressed shirt, smoothing the lapels of the old wool coat that had seen more meetings, more deals, more winters than my grandson had birthdays. The cane stood by the door, polished from years of use, its rhythm already in my bones before I even stepped outside. When I arrived, the square in front of the community center was already a small sea of people. Neighbors, officials, reporters, faces I didn't know, and faces I hadn't seen in years. The building loomed behind them, every line and angle exactly as I had once imagined it, though dressed now in red ribbon and the sheen of fresh completion. Cameras moved like restless insects, lenses swiveling to catch every handshake, every practiced smile. Someone from the mayor's staff met me at the curb, speaking quickly into a headset as though managing the arrival of royalty. My name was repeated twice into a microphone clipped to her coat. "Mr. Harold Halden is here, founding benefactor." And that phrase seemed to ripple outward through the crowd. Heads turned, some nodded, others looked puzzled, trying to place the name. My grandson was there too, standing just off to the side of the path they'd cleared for me. He shifted awkwardly when he saw me, then stepped forward, as if pulled by something beyond himself. Without a word, he fell into step beside me, close enough that I could feel the edge of his sleeve brush mine every few paces. The cane tapped a steady beat against the pavement, a rhythm older than the building itself, older than this boy who had once dismissed me in a single careless sentence. The closer we got to the stage, the more the crowd pressed in. Cameras swarmed, their shutters clicking like a chorus of impatient crickets. My grandson straightened, his shoulders squaring as if to shield me from the jostling, though we both knew it wasn't the crowd I needed protection from. Still, the gesture landed somewhere deep, in a place I thought had gone quiet. The mayor stood waiting at the base of the steps, the ribbon stretched behind him in a bright arc across the entrance. When our eyes met, his expression changed. Not the fixed, political smile I'd seen 100 times, but something softer, edged with memory. He stepped toward me, took my hand firmly, and leaned in just enough that the microphones caught his words. "You built this." 4 syllables, no fanfare, no preamble. And for once, it wasn't a line for the cameras, it was a confession, plain and unvarnished. His voice carried the weight of every afternoon he'd spent in the library I'd fought to save, every door I'd helped open before he knew how to knock. The cameras caught the handshake, the closeness, the way our eyes held for a beat too long for it to be staged. The crowd quieted just enough for the truth to settle in the air. My grandson looked from the mayor to me, and I saw it, the recognition, dawning like the slow rise of light in a dark room. We climbed the steps together, my cane striking the boards in time with my heart. The ribbon waited, the city waited, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man walking toward a stage. I felt like a man walking back into something he had built, step by deliberate step, until there was no question left about who had laid the first stone. The ribbon was smoother than I expected, the satin cool and heavy against my hands. It stretched between us, me on one end, the mayor on the other, bright against the pale winter morning, trembling slightly in the wind, as if it knew it was moments from becoming 2 pieces instead of 1. The crowd had gathered close now, cameras angled, lenses wide, the restless murmur of voices thinning into something quieter, more expectant. The mayor passed me the scissors, large, ceremonial, gleaming in the sunlight. Their weight was more symbolic than functional, but when I closed my fingers around them, I felt the pressure of every moment that had led here. My grandson stood just behind my shoulder, his shadow touching mine on the wooden planks of the stage. I didn't turn to look at him, but I could feel the stillness in his stance, the way his usual restless shifting had stilled into attention. We both took the ribbon in our hands, the mayor's grip firm, mine steady. He looked at me, not the quick glance of a politician keeping the ceremony moving, but a held look, as if he needed me to know that the moment wasn't for the cameras. I nodded once. We lifted the scissors together, and with one decisive motion, the blades bit into the satin. It didn't tear, it gave, like a mouth releasing a breath it had been holding for years. For the space of a heartbeat, the entire square hushed. Even the air seemed to pause, the cold held at bay by the collective inhale of everyone watching. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a child laughed. Not the polite laughter of adults or the self-conscious kind that comes when someone feels out of place, but a clear, high sound, pure and unguarded, the kind of laugh that belongs only to the very young and the very free. That sound found its way into my chest, bypassing all the walls I'd built over years of being overlooked, underestimated, and quietly erased. It settled there, in the space that had once shaken under the weight of other people's doubts, and it stilled everything. The noise of the crowd swelled again. Applause, cheers, camera shutters clicking like rainfall, but the only thing I heard was that single, bright laugh. I thought of the child's feet. One day running across the gymnasium floor I'd insisted be made of wood, so it would echo like a drum under every game. I thought of their hands pulling books from the library shelves I'd fought to keep in sunlight. I thought of their eyes catching the light through the tall reading room windows I'd demanded be built, so no one inside would ever feel like they were in a cage. The ribbon lay in two pieces now, one curling at my feet, the other in the mayor's hand. I didn't reach for it. It didn't matter. The cut was done, the opening made, and in that instant it no longer felt like a severing. It felt like a healing. I stepped back from the stage edge, cane tapping lightly, the cold no longer biting the way it had that morning. My grandson moved with me, close, as though this time it wasn't duty or habit but choice. And I realized that sometimes the cleanest cut isn't the one that divides, it's the one that opens. The applause was still rolling through the square when I felt a shift beside me. My grandson, who had been a quiet shadow through the entire ceremony, stepped forward, not toward the steps off the stage, but toward the microphone at its center. No one had called his name. No one had offered him the place. But his feet carried him there anyway, a current moving through him that even he didn't seem to fully understand. The mayor looked startled. The event coordinator froze with her clipboard halfway raised, but my grandson didn't hesitate. He wrapped his fingers around the microphone and for a moment just stood there, breathing into the sudden quiet. When he spoke, his voice was steady at first, but there was a tremor underneath it, thin at the edges like ice just before it cracks. "I said something cruel," he began. His words carried across the crowd, each syllable sharp in the cold air. "I told my grandfather he was too old to matter." A ripple moved through the listeners, some shifting uncomfortably, others glancing at me, perhaps wondering how I'd take hearing those words said aloud. He didn't stop. "I thought legacy was something you could see, something you could post or measure in noise." His throat tightened and the next words came slower, heavier. "But legacy isn't loud. It's load-bearing. It's the quiet weight that holds everything else up while no one notices." I felt those words land in me like the first thaw after a long winter. Not sudden, not explosive, but deep and steady. He turned then, away from the crowd, toward me. His hands opened, palms facing up as if he were offering something back that he had taken without realizing it. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words, simple and unadorned, but they fit into the exact shape of the wound he'd made months ago, the one I'd stopped expecting anyone to try to mend. There was no theatrical swell of music, no orchestrated gasp from the audience, just the kind of silence that means people are holding their breath so they don't miss a moment. My eyes stayed on his, not searching for guilt, not even for understanding, but for the shift I had been waiting for. And it was there. The boy who had once spoken without thinking was now a young man who had chosen to stand in front of strangers and speak because he had been thinking. The microphone hung in the air between us for a beat too long until he lowered it slowly, the sound system popping faintly as it disconnected from his voice. He stepped back to my side, and without looking down, I felt his hand brush against mine, not grasping, not clutching, but there, close enough that if I moved just slightly, we would be holding hands. I didn't move, not yet, but I knew I would. Because apologies, when they're real, don't just close wounds. They change the way you carry the weight that caused them in the first place. The crowd began to thin after the speeches, drifting toward the open doors where the warmth of the new building spilled out into the winter air. My grandson stayed close beside me as we moved inside, the mayor leading the way. The scent of fresh paint and new wood filled the lobby, mingling with the faint echo of footsteps on the polished floor. Every surface gleamed. Every corner held that charged stillness of a place not yet fully lived in, like it was holding its breath for the years ahead. At the far wall, draped in a simple white cloth, stood something I hadn't been told about. The mayor gestured for the remaining crowd to gather near, his voice softer now, the public tone replaced by something quieter. "Before we begin the tours," he said, "there's one more thing we need to do." His hand found the edge of the cloth, and with a steady pull it fell away. The bronze plaque caught the light like a held truth finally brought into the open. It wasn't ostentatious, no ornate borders, no gilded edges, just modest, exact lettering that spoke more like a statement than a celebration. Community Center, sustained by the quiet courage of those who gave before thanks was guaranteed. My eyes followed the lines downward until they found it, my name. Not larger than the others, not set apart, just present, exactly as I would have wanted. My hand brushed over the cool metal, fingertips tracing the grooves as if memorizing them by touch. The metal was smooth now, but I knew one day it would carry the warmth of 1,000 hands passing over it, perhaps not knowing who I was, but knowing they stood in a place that had been made possible by someone who cared before it was easy to care. The mayor turned to my grandson then, holding the ribbon we'd cut outside. Without a word, he placed it in his hands, a gesture so simple that it carried more weight than any speech. My grandson looked down at it, the satin curling softly in his palms, and I saw the faint tremor in his fingers. That piece of ribbon was more than a memento. It was a passing of something invisible, the quiet knowledge that legacy isn't a possession, but a responsibility. We stepped back toward the entrance together, 3 generations long now, my daughter joining us from the crowd, her hand on her son's shoulder. The winter light poured through the open doors, casting us in a shared shadow that stretched across the lobby floor and out into the street. As we crossed the threshold, I realized the truest measure of a life isn't whether it's celebrated in the moment or whether your name is spoken when you're still around to hear it. It's whether the doors you built keep opening after you're gone, whether the spaces you shaped continue to welcome those who will never know your face. And today, those doors stood wide. The air rushing through them was cold and bright, carrying the sound of children's laughter from somewhere just beyond the steps. My cane tapped softly against the stone as we walked forward, together, into a future I had helped make possible, one step at a time on a road my hands had built long before anyone thought to say thank you.